All right. Hi, this is Stephen Dare and Arash Kamiar at MetroJacksonville.com. And today we are joined by a couple of very prominent attorneys here in Jacksonville to talk about the issue of juveniles in the adult criminal justice system. Hank Cox and Gray Thomas, you guys have been involved with this issue for a while, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better, does it?
If the question is, does the treatment of juveniles in the adult criminal justice system seem to be getting any better? Not here in Jacksonville, from what we can, not in Florida.
Now, what seems to be the basic problem? I think that most people, when they think about this issue, I don't think they do. I think they think about it in response to headlines. And it's headlines about a 12-year-old killing somebody and then being sentenced as an adult, and that is literally all the thought that most people give it. So what is actually happening? And why is it a change from the past?
Well, I think you have to look, and I'll defer to Gray too, but I think you have to look at what's happened in the last 10 years or so, where the national medical community, the researchers, the scientists, and the experts have now realized that a child's brain and the frontal lobe of the brain that controls all the decision making hasn't developed anything close to what an adult has. So the U.S. Supreme Court says, well, if that's true, do we treat children the same way we treat adults? And their answer was no, you can't. They're not as... Go ahead.
So what happened? Where was the switch? If the Supreme Court has said no, why are we now? How can a judge finally say, this 13-year-old is 30?
That's the $64,000 question.
I don't have that kind of money. What's the answer?
Okay, I'll give you that $4 question.
And the law has yet to catch up with the science in terms of recognizing that. I mean, the sentencing schemes that apply to adult sentences, when applied to juveniles who don't have the maturity and the judgment and the brain development, simply is putting an apple in the basket of oranges. They don't relate well to each other.
And let's bring this down to what's actually happening. So a 12 or a 15-year-old kid commits a crime, and then instead of going through the juvenile justice system, they are committed over to what is the adult justice system, and they face life imprisonment, and they face 20 and 30-year sentences. And so you have a 15 or a 12-year-old that goes from 5th grade to the big house, and they're quartered in adult facilities. And of course, if you're reading along, they're also being raped, and that's an unintentional part of their sentence from the time that they are 15 until they are 25, 35, 45, when they are let go. Is that fair?
Yeah, you have to be careful that you're not mixing two totally separate issues here. Okay. No one is saying that a 15-year-old is not responsible for what the 15-year-old did. No one is saying that the 12-year-old doesn't understand right from wrong. The issue is, how does the criminal justice system treat them when the criminal justice system knows, or should know, that that child's brain has not developed in the area where you appreciate the consequences of what you're doing, you have the ability to resist influences of others, you have far less impulse control. And that's what the whole issue is all about. Do you treat the 14-year-old the same way you treat the 30-year-old? And the U.S. Supreme Court and the experts medically across the country say you can't do that. That's not civilized to do that.
There's a huge difference between just the basic notion of understanding the difference between right and wrong versus having an appreciation of the consequences of one's conduct at the time that you engage in that conduct.
So, I mean, what you guys are saying is essentially is like, it's not an issue of being tough on crime. It's about an issue of like redeeming the kid, about fixing them.
If that's possible. And so do you just warehouse a 14-year-old for 40 years in an adult prison, or do you try to determine what precipitated the problem? Are there alternatives to that? It may be incarceration for some period of time.
But we don't have time for that. Do we? I mean, do we have time to take a kid and like try to,
if you got
as a
time
government?
to spend the money it takes to warehouse people in this country, in this state, you've got the time to do that. This country leads the world, continues to lead the world in incarcerating its own people at astronomical cost.
But at least
there's got to be some of that money available to look at these kids.
Oh, I don't think the jury is at all in on a conclusion that we're safer from monstrous incarceration rates. Look at many other countries that with far lower incarceration rates that are much safer.
But it's keeping us from going out in public and having random shooters killing us, isn't it?
No.
You know, and going back to this issue, like, I think before we talk about how we got to tough on crime equals locking people up without any measurable effect to the society around it, the costs. So, we were looking at a report not very long ago that even here locally at the Duval County Jail, it costs them, once you factor in all the costs, $750 a day per prisoner. And this is a person who hasn't been found guilty yet. This doesn't add in the cost of maximum security prisons. It doesn't add in the cost of tracking them in their long-term health care. And for $750 a day, to take a kid and $750 a day, you could quarter them at the Omni Hotel downtown.
You could hire 2 people to watch over him.
A chauffeur. They could have a top-of-the-line Porsche on a rental
Hank could be
daily.
his personal attorney.
You could get a massage.
Maybe.
And you could probably afford a massage with, a happy ending for their counselor if you assign them a caseworker. And it's a prodigious amount of money. Why are we spending that money on putting them in prisons rather than in a rehabilitative or a counseling environment?
Well, that's exactly the point. It is far less expensive to help someone than to lock them up involuntarily. There are, as Hank said a minute ago, there are people who need to be incarcerated for the protection of society or potentially other reasons. Maybe that's the only way to help them with a certain small class of people. But it is a lot less expensive to help somebody on the front end than to incarcerate them on the back end. If we don't take care of our children when they are children, then we're dooming them and ourselves to the consequences of kids with no help becoming adults who are then, at the very least, non-productive members of society.
Every time we get a discussion about this on the forums, anytime there's a teenager who is killed by cops or is caught in the middle of a crime, we have a flood of commenters, some of them who are normally intelligent people, talking about that maybe death is the actual outcome for when a kid commits a crime. And, it doesn't seem like there's a constituency for any type of fairness when it comes to the treatment of crime in our society. Do you guys, has that gotten worse in your careers? Or?
I think it actually in some states has improved. But the only reason it's improved, in my judgment, is because of cost. People are so sensitive to the expense right now that they're desperately searching for ways to reduce cost. And finally, somebody started looking at the prison systems in this country, the federal, the state, and everything else. So we could cut here, we can cut there. And people who run for office, use this state as an example, and I've joked with Gray about it. If you run for the mosquito control district, you got to be tough on crime. You got to promise us constituents you're going to be tough on crime. You run for the school board, you got to be tough. You run for anything, you got to be tough on crime. And that developed in the late 80s and early 90s because public safety has emotional appeal to people. You get the headline that says this person, this 14-year-old's dangerous, he did something horrible. Everyone goes, well, they need to lock him up. Well, that's the human reaction in this day and age. You got to lock them up.
We've built an incredibly expensive infrastructure for funneling adults and children into a correctional facility. And I wanted to ask you guys, do we have the capacity or the facilities to treat people in a fair way, or to even treat the juveniles? Do we have dependency? Do we have counseling? Is that even available here locally, or have we diverted all the resources towards correction?
Well, that is a big problem, is that that resources have been focused on the punitive end, the corrections end. They call it corrections. It's something of a misnomer, I would say. And we make sure to fund policing, which is necessary, but a lot of this comes at a cost of the rehabilitative efforts, the dependency system. Foster care is, woefully inadequate in many ways. There are so many resources that could be available to help children that are underfunded, and particularly at points in time like this, where the federal, state, and local governments are in financial crisis.
But aren't they in financial crisis because they're spending $750 a day minimum on things like this?
Well, could be part of it.
So that's part of the
And that's
problem.
why people are revisiting how much is being spent on corrections.
So I think I read in Duval County about 43% of the children who are arrested, they're arrested for misdemeanors, for like small possession of marijuana, schoolyard fights, that sort of thing.
Could be.
And so they're being locked into a system that potentially can impact the rest of their life. Like what are the strategies around that to loop them out of the system?
Well, I think, and I'll again defer to Gray, one of the debates that's going on in this community right now is intervention and not throwing a kid into the criminal justice system. Because once that happens, that kid carries a label. Gone are the days where, and people still believe it's true, if I go into the juvenile system as a 11-year-old or a 15-year-old, that's all confidential and that doesn't follow me. Those days are gone. It's following you.
Really?
So you apply to college, you try to go in the military, you try to get a job. All these things follow you. So the idea is give these kids some intervention, work with them, and keep them out of the criminal justice system, and then deal with that narrow number that can't survive that process.
So how
But it's not going to be perfect.
Well,
do we know how we do that? Do we have an idea?
Certainly. I mean, there's a device in the adult system called a notice to appear, where you don't have to take somebody to jail. They don't have to miss 2 days of work. Or in the child system, there's a debate about shouldn't, for at least low-level offenses, we be issuing civil citations, where there certainly will be a consequence, but the child doesn't miss school. The child's parents don't have to miss work in order to go to court with their child. That for these low-level, especially first offense situations, you are able to take a far less costly approach, less costly both to the system and to the child and to the child's family.
I've never said this publicly before.
Well, now's the time.
But I've always believed that juvenile court should begin at 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon. It doesn't. It begins at 8:30 or 9 in the morning. The child misses class. The parent misses work. Start court after school's out, so he doesn't miss any classes. And we all remember school. The first class is English, the next class is history, the next class is math. So if you make me go to 3 court appearances, I've missed 3 English classes, 3 history classes, and 3 math classes. The same one each time.
Well, this is actually very.
That's just very minor.
This is
thing.
personal
But it's
to
just,
me.
I never understood that.
To the
I
point,
went through this entire process when I was a teenager. You know, I was a runaway. I came from a fairly abusive background. And so, you know, I lived in Bishop Cottage over at the Baptist Home for Children over off of Bartram. And my sister and I spent time in the Youth Crisis Center, back when it was still the Transient Youth Center. And, you know, there's that tracking within the system between delinquency and dependency. And, you know, my sister and I were very lucky. You know, we had other alternatives. Our home life wasn't so great, but we had an expanded network of support that kind of refunneled us and redirected us. But I spent, 2 months at Duval House over on Phillips Highway. I can't tell you what happened to the rest of the kids that I saw. Mm-hmm. You know, I saw a 12-year-old kid come in because he had run away from home with his best friend, and then a few years later, he was being tried as an adult, and he's dead now. You know, that kid ended up dead in jail, I think at Rayford. And there was no good outcome to any of that. And I wonder, where did we get off the rails where, you know, it's like it's so easy to say, well, 10, 20, 30, you're out. 1, 2, 3, you're out. When did that become our standard of justice? And when did we take away the responsibility of the judges and the attorneys to work out what is an equitable case-by-case disposition?
Well, let me ask a question. Mm-hmm. I've got 3 children. They're not in prison. You may have children. You got children. They're not in prison. So why do we care? I mean, an answer to your question is, do people in this day and age care if it's not the children they have or they know or their neighbors' kids? Mm-hmm. Does anybody, I mean, not does anybody, there's certainly plenty of people who do, but do enough people care about children they don't know, they've never met, but recognize that they're all children of the same society. And that may sound like some noble statement, but that's true. That is genuinely true. Is it an investment we have to make for all children? We don't know. Or is it, not my problem, not my neighborhood?
Well, what's the answer to this? I mean, you guys are involved in efforts to bring awareness to the issue. Are you guys working to change the issue?
Well, you elect us to the legislature, we'll get a good jump start on it, but that's not.
running?
No. I'm afraid I couldn't say all the right things to get elected. I think, and Gray may disagree, what some of us who've been involved, several of us were involved in representing a 12-year-old here in Jacksonville, a 16-year-old prior to that in Jacksonville, is just to keep the issue out there. As long as we can do something that gets it part of people's consciousness, that it is an issue, and they talk about it, and they consider it, and go back to what I said a moment ago. If people would stop, or more people would stop and say, how kids I don't know behave can affect all of us. Affect us in cost, in the quality of life, risk, safety. They're all issues to all of us.
And when those kids grow up, it will affect all of us as well.
Oh, yeah, because they come out at 45 with the experience of 14 through 45 in prison.
So
That's right.
How is JSO responding to this? Are they aware that there's maybe an issue here? Are they
Well,
concerned?
I think there, if I recall correctly, there was a compact signed by the sheriff and the chief judge and the public defender committing to this idea of intervention, not putting kids in jail, issuing notices to appear. And we're not talking about a 15-year-old shoot somebody in a robbery and give them notice to appear. We're not talking about that. We're talking about those kids who can be, targeted as not being necessarily going to be a problem down the road if you do the right thing at the front end. So the sheriff signed off on that compact, and I understand he made a commitment that
You think that means anything?
should have the sheriff sitting here.
Yeah.
I mean, see what's changed as a result of that. I couldn't speak for the sheriff.
Okay.
So really, this is a beginning of a conversation that we need to have. We don't know what the parameters of the change are or the mechanics of it. We don't know how to proceed. We have some good idea, but this is all about understanding that it's time to change. Yes?
Right, and just go back to the 12-year-old that several of us collectively
Tragic case.
represented.
Who? What case?
Christian Fernandez. If you track his life up to the age of 12 and the event that led to it, you're talking about somebody physically abused, sexually abused, who reported a stepfather for physically abusing him, whose response to that was to go home and kill himself in front of the two siblings. All those things. Where was the intervention on that? Why didn't somebody say, hey, time out. Hey, child, you were born to a mother who got pregnant at the age of 11. And she was 12 when she gave birth to you. Where was everybody through all that to say this whole event that got all the attention could have been prevented?
And when Hank says everybody, that means everybody. Because how about the medical personnel when his mother gave birth to him at that young age?
Right.
How about all of the law enforcement contacts? How about the Department of Children and Families contacts that showed up, but the follow-through wasn't there?
It sounds
Well,
like.
it's to hell with that, but when you commit a crime,
Well, it seems like
30 years.
Is it?
Yeah? What was his original sentence? What was he facing?
No, he was facing life in prison
Life
as an
in
adult
prison.
with no parole. That's what he was facing.
And what was the actual circumstances of that crime? Or it was
He had hurt his 2-year-old brother when he was home alone with his brother.
on purpose or accidentally? or
No, he was roughhousing with him, and he hurt him bad enough to call his mother right away and say, I think he's hurt. And mother came home right away and
Didn't know what to do.
didn't know what to do, so she didn't take the child for medical attention for 8.5 hours, and the injuries had some brain swelling, and it just kept going. And
But come on, she had a child when she was 12. Obviously, she had all kinds of time for parenting and learning how to do that and the right thing to do in
Right,
between getting
right.
beaten by her husband, right?
how many 14-year-old girls do you know are in foster care with their 2-year-old sons? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the whole.
Well, who?
My only point is,
Plus, and she's how can she trust the system or systems that have not been beneficial to her in the least?
Never helped her
I mean, so
in any meaningful way.
So how did we get to the point where we look at that situation and we go try the kid as an adult?
Well, if you go back, it reminds me of when I said to a judge in a hearing when he said we, and I said, don't include me in that we, right? Because the United States Supreme Court in 2005, 2011, 2011 said over and over again, these kids' brains have not developed.
so then is it
Right?
unconstitutional?
You know,
Is it unconstitutional
who was
to
listening
try a
to
kid
that?
as an adult?
It's not unconstitutional.
Why not? If the Supreme Court has said this is a different
they said
The
scenario.
Supreme Court has held that it is unconstitutional to impose a mandatory life sentence with no opportunity for release on a juvenile.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court has yet to draw some further lines. They've now drawn that distinction in both non-homicide and also in homicide cases.
Okay.
But there is a lot of evolution left to be done.
But what they have
People
said,
go.
but what they have said in every case is you need government to recognize that that child's brain and the frontal lobe that controls all the decision making, all the judgment, all the appreciation of consequences is nowhere near as developed as an adult. So you can't punish that kid the same way you would an adult.
And there's medical evidence, and at your TED Talk, you actually presented some graphic support that show physically the part of the brain
It's frontal cortex.
isn't
frontal
there.
lobe.
It's not grown yet.
Right.
Right.
Now, I'll tell you what, that 14-year-old kid can throw a fastball twice as fast as his father because his body's developed, every part of his body. The 13-year-old girl can have a baby, but it's that frontal lobe and frontal cortex that medical science in the last 10 or 12 years has said, time out. We now know why that 13 or 14-year-old kid doesn't appreciate the consequences of driving a car 60 miles an hour through a school zone.
Well,
You're going
Hank,
to kill somebody.
Great. If somebody wants to get involved in this, they feel passionately about it, and I think there are a lot of people do. And with our incarceration rates, it's Florida. It's a pirate state. Come on. Everybody knows somebody in jail in this city, and they're related to a cousin that lives out on the west side somewhere. That everybody has this in their families and in their friend group. How do you get involved in this?
There are all kinds of different ways. I mean, there's the Juvenile Justice Coalition recently formed. There's the Dolores Barr Weaver Policy Center that's focused on young girls. There are opportunities to volunteer for service as anything from a guardian ad litem to potentially being a foster parent. So there are certainly the opportunities that are out there.
All right, this is the beginning of a conversation, I can tell. This is, I'm sure, going to spill over to our forums and hopefully to a larger community discussion. I'm sure Arash and Not Now and Bridge Troll and a few of the people that justice and criminal justice issues are a recurring theme on our forums. I'm sure you guys will join us in this conversation and make it lively as well as informative. Hank, Gray, thank you so much for your good work.
Thank you.
Appreciate
And
it.
thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.